Join the sexual evolution and get ready for Sex is Medicine. Formerly known as Better Love and Sex, Sex is Medicine is your #1 resource for holistic sex education. Explore the connection between sexuality and spirituality, pleasure and personal growth. Discover the art of using pleasure as medicine and reclaim your birthright to more joy, more pleasure, and more satisfaction in every area of your life. Every week on Sex is Medicine with Davie Ward.
Good evening. I am Davie Ward, and you are listening to Sex is Medicine, your #1 resource for holistic sex education, or one of them anyway. I want to thank you for joining us this wonderful Thursday evening. You can catch Sex is Medicine every Thursday evening at 7 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, 10 p.m. Eastern, and you can catch the replay of this and every awesome, fabulous show on iTunes and TuneIn Radio. Just look for Sex is Medicine with Davie Ward. This evening, we are going to be talking about sexual healing in the form of, I'm going to say, justice. And what I mean by this is that when it comes to healing, we must acknowledge that there is actually something to heal. The analogy that I like to give is if we have a splinter in our hand, and we ignore the fact that we have a splinter in our hand and we just keep going around our daily life, it's either going to get really infected and our finger's going to get really sore, or perhaps if it's driven in deep enough, the skin may grow over it and it may appear to heal. But what's actually going on under the surface of the skin is a festering, pussy wound that could turn into gangrene, and you'll have to have your finger chopped off down the line. So the point of all this is that when it comes to healing, we must acknowledge that there is a wound. And in order to fully heal, we must kind of go in there and dig up that splinter and pull it out, so that all of the skin and all of the tissue can actually repair itself and new healthy tissue can form. And so all of this brings me to the conversation this evening, which is about healing, from my point of view, healing the wounding in the field of sex education in the United States in regards to women and men of color. To help us in this healing is we need education and we need information, more education and more information than I currently have. So I'm very honored and very excited to have my guest this evening, Bianca, who is an award-winning Latina Negra, sexologist who has been in the U.S. field, sexology field, for over 15 years. Her background is in Black and Latina sexualities, education, media justice, and youth culture. She resides in New York City, and she is co-directing a feature-length documentary film titled Black Pervert, about the intersections of Black and kink communities. She is a founding member of Women of Color Sexual Health Network. She's one of the many women I've had on the show who are members of the Women of Color Sexual Health Network, which I myself am a member of, and founder of Latina Negra Project and LatinoSexuality.com, and director of education at Scenarios USA. So that is her full, wonderful bio. And thank you very much, Bianca, for being here on the show with us this evening.
Hi, Debbie. Thanks so much for having me.
Yes, it's an absolute pleasure. So I wasn't quite sure how to do the lead-in for this show, but for me, again, the purpose of doing the show is to bring awareness, to bring education, so that we can have healing in regards to being a person of color and being a people of color in the United States, but particularly in the field of sexuality. And this is one of your specialities. So could you share a little bit about your experience of being a woman of color in the sex education industry in the United States?
Sure. It's interesting because I never really saw women of color represented in a sexuality and powerful capacity for a really long time. So, it's interesting because I have this connection with Vanessa Del Rio. And yes, the pornographic star, one of the first Puerto Rican pornographic stars in the U.S. And when I saw her in one of her films, I remember her just being so powerful that she could just take over the entire space. She could devour whoever she wanted to. And that connection was really powerful for me because I thought to myself, I want that kind of power. And I want to know how I can use it to my advantage. And that was really my start and my introduction to the field of sexuality and sexology, and also where women of color were represented only. So when I came into the field, it was pretty lonely. Lots of people who were not from my community. My parents are immigrants into the United States from Puerto Rico, so they had a very immigrant experience, not speaking the language, things of that nature. So not seeing people who had a similar background or who even spoke to communities like mine until probably 10 years ago. So I've been in this field for 20 years, and the first 10 was really, really lonely. I had great mentors, but again, they could only mentor me up until a certain extent around professionalism and job searching and something. But when it came to actually trying to get a job or challenging stereotypes about who I am when I'm actually on the job, those were some things that my mentors just weren't able to do. So I was really excited when I started to find more women of color doing a variety of different work in the sexuality field. So everything, not just from sex work, which initially introduced me to the field, but everything from, physicians, medical providers, counselors, therapists, midwives. There was a variety of communities that were available to me when I started to expand my idea of the sexology field as well as who does the work. So that, I think, is a quick little summation of what my experience has been like.
Mm-hmm. And so being a woman of color in this industry, what are some of the unique challenges that you find for other women of color? Like, what are some of the unique challenges that you feel we have to face?
I would say, for sure, being, and a lot of these overlap with other topics that you might hear about, whether it comes to class or racial identity or what have you. But I think a big one is that we're always the only one in a particular space, or we're never one of the people in a particular space. So, for example, when I think about conferences that are held in our field, the number of people of color who are asked to be keynotes rarely is one or just started to become one of several. So that's troubling to me, as well as, those are also paid opportunities, hopefully, for many of us. So access to employment in the field of our choice, beyond being an outreach worker. So, kind of being siloed or characterized as only being able to do one job in our field, not being able to be management, supervisory, or director, limits our ability to find financial stability in our field. So that's an additional challenge. I also have experienced a lot of other women of color sharing experiences of having to either tolerate or figure out new ways to take care of themselves and cope when they experience white supremacy in their professional lives. And that's been really frustrating in a variety of ways. So that can be everything from microaggressions to, overt forms of discrimination. So there's a variety of different experiences that we have. And I think the biggest challenge is that it's not just one experience. It can be a multitude of things because it's a variety. It's the way that our identities connect to one another. So we're constantly bringing our gender with us. We're bringing our race, our culture, our background, our location, all of those things with us. So we're not all going to have exactly the same experience, but all of those things will result in having a specific one for sure.
So thank you so much for that. And one thing you mentioned, white supremacist culture. Could you explain a little bit about how that works? Because, for me, I'll just do some background on me. So I came across an article that you guys had written. I think it's probably about a year or 2 years ago now, about a particular book that had been published and no people of color were included in it. And the term white supremacist culture popped up on my radar, and I was like, oh my God, like I hadn't even thought of it that way. And how does this even work? And so for me, the way it works is just kind of this passing over of people of color as insignificant or not as important, or like you mentioned, keynote presenters at conferences, like nobody even thinks about including people of color, and it doesn't even, show up on people's radar that something might be missing. And I see it, in television shows when 90% of the people on the television show, they're all white. It's like, there's gotta be more people in this community that are people of color. And the only time you see them on TV are when it's scenes about the ghetto or, inner city life. But in these nice white suburbs, they're all white people, So just this idea that white kind of reigns supreme, and this lack of awareness even that there's something other than that or something missing. So how do you see that operating in the sex education field?
Right. So I would agree. And we made a deliberate choice when we wrote that letter to not use the term racism, but instead use the term white supremacy. Because for us, we believe that language is alive, that it's ever-changing, and that this is how we approach language in many different ways. So we saw using the term white supremacy as shifting the way that we discuss race, as well as how people are comfortable discussing race. And so forcing people who thought that they were good with it, that they were an ally, that they knew everything they needed to know already, and then being shown a different term that people of color have chosen to use to talk about their specific experience. So that was a very deliberate and intentional choice, and that's one that we stuck with since the year that we published that, which was, I believe, November of 2014. So I think you're right. It's a multitude of things as well. It's also systems. So, the sexuality field is no different from law, is no different from, culinary arts. I mean, the sexism, the misogyny that people experience, the economic injustice, all of those things you find in a variety of different ways. So sexuality is just one small sampling of the rest of society. So that book is one example of how people of color are just never considered experts or even people who have intelligence around this topic. I think people also do a lot of debunking around the knowledge that people have, especially people of color in the field and women of color in the field, because they over-sexualize us, they fetishize us in a way that other people have not been. But also our ancestors built the entire field of the United States. It was the bodies of Black enslaved women, of African women who were used for gynecological examinations or practices or experimentations, whatever they were, right? And there's a variety of documentation around this. So this is just a couple of examples of how the field was really built by women of color as a majority of this country and the things that we know. So it's just one example of structural and systemic forms of power and how whiteness has been used in a way to overpower other people.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. And when you mentioned that the sex education field has been built upon the bodies of women of color, could you give a few examples? Because for me, this is so, again, it's information that we, in mainstream America, we don't have access to. And in my own investigation, I read a book called Medical Apartheid, and then I've also read the work of Dr. Joy DeGruy, and just was shocked at what I found and appalled that this information that you've got to dig, that this isn't part of our normal Western curriculum, what happened to these people. So could you give some examples of how women of color specifically were used to advance sex education in the United States?
Sure. I think you just gave two really great examples when you just first respond to that question around, the work of Dorothy Roberts and other Black academics who are doing this work and research as well. So, thinking about how people consider Dr. Sims the father of gynecology in the United States. And if we look back into the archives that are well documented, as physicians often have done, you see that the bodies that were used were enslaved African women. So, there's the issue of consent right there, because we know that people who were enslaved in this country were not seen as people, they were seen as property. So issues of consent and medical misuse arise from there, but also we learn about the body in many different ways. So there's some really traumatic and horrific history that I'm going to give examples around that have benefited us to this day. Like, I still benefit from that type of medical abuse, as well as all of our listeners this evening. I think also about like the Tuskegee experiment. We learned a lot about what we needed to do legally around informed consent, but also what were the barriers for Black families to be able to build the home and the future that they wanted. You know, one of the big selling points for getting participants in Tuskegee was offering them burial plots, and that their burials would be covered 100%, because these men wanted their families to not worry about burying them or using funds to do so. So that's connected to economic justice as well. I think about Henrietta Lacks, who in Baltimore, Maryland, had cervical cancer, and we did not know. And her cells, the HeLa cells, have been ones that have been shipped and sold internationally around the world. That's why we have the vaccinations that we do. It's why we have an HPV test. And as someone who has survived cervical cancer cells and have, benefited from that test and what we've learned, it's a constant struggle for me as well to think about, how do I pay homage to the people whose bodies have allowed me to heal, and what do I do to take care of myself so that I can, honor that legacy that I've been given. So I really appreciate you starting this, talking about healing as well.
Yeah, and I think, part of the healing, like I was saying, is acknowledgement, and that's also giving credit where credit is due. It's an honoring, because, we look at all the holidays we have in this country for Benjamin Franklin and, I want to say Christopher Columbus, but that's in debate. There aren't too many. He's getting protests, so I won't bring him up. But there's a lot of homage paid to our founding fathers, and in terms of, especially when I found out about how the first speculum was created and the torture that these Black women had to undergo at the hands of this person, so that, other people of privilege could have their vaginas checked in a nice way and, and not get cancer. And it's paying homage. It's giving credit. It's having respect for human life. I think that's what it boils down to for me, is having respect for the human lives that were lost and were given so that we may have the privileges that we have today.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. So in regards to healing from this, you mentioned that finding pleasure is imperative. So why is that for you?
It's primarily because that's how I also came to the field. Watching pornography was not only about my own curiosity, but the pleasure that I experienced seeing another woman who looked like me, having the power that I totally thought was possible for me to have, was a form of pleasure, to feel affirmed and seen. And even if it was through the sex work industry, it doesn't matter to me. I've been in the sex work field too. So I think that pleasure is so important, and the work that we do when we do sex education or sex work or research, that we're also doing some caretaking, because we're definitely dealing with people with the level of knowledge that they're at, with what they need, and we're helping people make choices that can save their lives. So in many ways, we're also caretakers, and a lot of times caretakers aren't always considered when we think about healing, because we only see them as the healers. But the healers also need to be rejuvenated and supported. So pleasure to me in that way is really important, because I see myself needing that kind of to be sustained. Like, that's what I need. But also because I feel as though, and I believe that my pleasure is me at my strongest, me at my most powerful. So even when it comes to sexual pleasure, I think that's a real gift that I give other people who are able to see that, because I'm at my strongest and my most powerful. And that's rare for some people to see at times. And it's important for me to choose who I want to share that power with, or who I want to give that gift to. But also, I think pleasure is just one of those areas of our lives that is women of color, especially Black and Latino women. We've never been given the permission to really take over our pleasure and claim our own pleasure, and not just have it over our body, but have it with our body. So not having this competition of needing to take over something, but really working together with our bodies and what that looks like and feels like and being present for that experience. I think that can really help with happiness and depression for some individuals, especially myself, based on personal experience. But I think it also just shifts our perspective in certain ways when we know that we can experience pleasure, that we deserve it, and that we're able to give it to ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's empowering, and it's a key to our sense of self-empowerment to feel comfortable and shame-free about allowing ourselves to receive pleasure. And that's, in the work that I do, I find this for both men and women and people of all races and all genders, is that allowing themselves to receive pleasure beyond the prescribed few minutes. Like we have our, our clock in our mind of what's appropriate. Like, okay, I can, have 2 minutes of pleasure, 3 minutes of pleasure, 10 minutes of pleasure. And then people start to get agitated. But to actually be able to relax and receive extended pleasure without feeling this urge to have to give back is revolutionary, quite frankly, for many, many people. They go through a lot of stuff. We all go through a lot of stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
In regards to, you mentioned something centering the sexual pleasure of Black women as racial justice. Can you expand upon that? I love that concept.
Sure. So when I think about justice, I think about equity. And, you can tell me later if you think I should talk about the difference between equality and equity. But
No, do. I want to hear it.
Do? Okay.
Yeah.
One of the examples that I gave my students when I was teaching in college, the difference between equality and equity. So starting with equality, if everybody came into the classroom and then I asked everyone to give me their shoes. So I had a bunch of shoes, and then I handed the shoes back out randomly to students. So every student came in with 2 pairs of shoes, or, 2 of shoe on each foot, and every student is going to leave with 2 shoes because that's what they came in with. The problem, though, is that people might not get the same shoes they came in with. People's shoes might not fit. They might not be able to stand up or walk out or do what they need to do for the rest of the day. But the reality is they still got their 2 shoes. That's equality, right? So we see the challenges of equality. Not everybody has the same outcome. If we do it from an equitable standpoint, where I ask everyone to give me their shoes, I jumble them up, and then I start to give them out again, my process would be a little bit different. I could either ask people to point out their shoes, or I could give people back the shoes that they gave me. Either way, people leave with shoes that work for them, that fit for them. They're able to do what they plan to do, and everybody has the same outcome. So that's equity, where regardless of who you are, where you come from, if you need to access condoms, you're able to go to the same place that this person over here goes and be treated exactly the same, have the exact same outcome, which is purchase the condoms in a pleasant and non-shameful way. So that would be equity versus equality. So I hope that helps capture that difference.
That does very much. That does very much. Good. I just want to point, and I've heard it explained of the difference between equality and justice.
Yeah.
So I like equality and equity. That's beautiful concept. So sorry, go on.
Thank you. So when I think about pleasure as a form of racial justice for Black women, especially sexual pleasure, I come from that in a place of, thinking about who I know in my life, as well as the stories that people have emailed me. I mean, I'm sure you, as well as many other people in our field, get tons of, emails and contact via social media with questions and stories. And it's primarily rooted in sexual pleasure, but also taking back pleasurable experiences sexually with other people. So, I get a lot of people who have been traumatized or sexually assaulted, and who are, have gone through therapy, and are part of their healing process is to reclaim their sexual power and energy. And I think that's revolutionary for a Black woman to choose to survive in this world today, but also to choose to experience pleasure and to say it and to claim it and to say that it is hers. I think that's really powerful. And for me, that's where justice and equity come in. Like, if we imagine that all Black women could be treated in the same way and protected in the same way that racially white women are in this country, we would really have a different experience. And I think it could be really, really amazing to hear other stories and see other experiences, but also for people to have their own levels of privacy to honor that as well. Because I feel like right now, Black women don't have privacy. We are not allowed to be our full selves in public or even in private sometimes. And I think that is a huge injustice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and and also, so for me, growing up in as a biracial woman in mostly white, quote unquote, white society, and some of the experiences I had as a child, as a young woman growing up, growing into my sexuality, and having white men want me, like literally would say, for a piece of brown sugar on the side, like literally that's what they would say to me, and I'm just like,
Wow.
experiences like that. Or I had this one boy this cute little white boy I was so in love with, and he was so in love with me, and his parents found out we were dating and they threatened to disown him. So
Wow.
experiences like that, white women are just not going to have that experience. I love white women. White women are my best friends.
Right.
And yet there's an experience that I had as a woman of color growing up that they're just not ever going to have. And it wouldn't even show up on their radar. They wouldn't even think of having that kind of experience. So yeah, the idea of being fetishized, the idea of being less than, not as good as, and then, back in the day, my Black husband could have been lynched if he looked sideways at a white woman walking down the street. So I think that history needs to be taken into account when we're having a discussion about sex and pleasure and people of color and race.
For sure. I agree. And that's one of the reasons why I'm really committed to the work that we both do. And I'm really excited to see the membership grow for the Women of Color Sexual Health Network. But we know that we're here, that there are others, and that we can really form a community that supports one another in a way that we might not have had before.
Bianca, before we begin with our next segment, would you be willing to share your website for those people who are wanting to get in contact with you?
Sure. So I'm at BiancaLaureano.com, and there's lots of vowels, so I'll spell it out, BiancaLaureano.com. You can find that more at Debbie's website as well. She'll have the information up. And then the Women of Color Sexual Health Network is our acronym, WOCSHN, WOCSHN.org.
Wonderful. So before the break, we were talking about the Women of Color Sexual Health Network. So could you share a bit more about why that was created and the vision for it?
Sure. So the Women of Color Sexual Health Network was formed in about 2008, 2009, when there was 18 women and people of color who were at the ASEC conference in Phoenix. And ASEC is the American Association of Sexuality Educators, Counselors, and Therapists. And we just didn't see ourselves except for in the specific workshops that centered women of color. And that was it. We didn't see ourselves anywhere else. And we kept running into each other. And we decided, what's going on here? Why are we the only 18 people of color who are women at this conference? And it was from there that we started to realize that we needed connections, we needed support, and that was why the Women of Color Sexual Health Network was founded. So we went through all of the layers of whatever the internet turned into. So we started off as a Google group or a Yahoo group, then went into a Google group, and now we're on several social media platforms sharing several different opportunities. So our main goal right now is to increase the representation of women of color in the sexuality field, as well as push people to be a part of creating and deconstructing a new vision of sexuality education, specifically one that doesn't include white supremacy. So it's changing the white supremacists in the field so that it no longer exists. Those are our 2 to 3 main goals currently. Then we have other smaller goals in mind. So, for example, supporting people who are choosing to get various forms of certification to increase their income or their practice and their reach, as well as supporting people and providing opportunities where people can become published, because that's one element of financial stability and increasing visibility for women of color as well.
Absolutely. And I have to say, it's like an oasis in the desert, the Women of Color Sexual Health Network. And it's just added, connecting with other women of color in the sexuality field has added such a dimension of depth and soulfulness and validation for me as a professional, and just given me so many more avenues of expression and so many more opportunities to learn and grow. I love learning from other women of color in this field, and it's just so impressive and so wonderful. So it's an incredible service that you and the organization have provided for all of us.
Great. Thanks so much, Debbie. And, it's really interesting because, not just interesting, but heartwarming, because I really loved watching how excited people were to meet you and Marla and other people that were attending Sex Down South earlier this year. And so that was really exciting, that people were able to meet up. They were looking forward to seeing each other. I mean, those are the types of experiences we definitely want women of color in the community, in the field, to have, is looking forward to attending something, not just because you're going to know another person there, but because you actually have some type of solidarity and investment in them because they have that in you as well.
Oh, yes. It's beautiful and absolutely refreshing. And so you mentioned wanting, a part of the mission is growing the field of sex education to eradicate white supremacy. What would that look like, and how would you go about it?
Right. So that's the big question, right? What does that look like? And I think the things that I've learned, I'm almost 40, what I've learned in my life has been that people's ideas of freedom and liberation are not exactly like my own. So I have my own vision. Trina and Marietta, the other two founding members, have their own visions. And we have many, many similarities that create this foundation of our ideal world that we're willing to share with one another. So I say that to preface that my vision is not like everybody else's, but I would like to think that some of the core parts definitely are. So I would first start with healing for all communities. And I say that because not just people of color need to experience healing. I think everybody does.
Yes.
Excuse me. There's lots and lots of historical trauma, similar to what you and I have formally talked about with Henrietta Lacks, Tuskegee experiment, etc. Like me holding on and figuring out like how I benefit from medical abuse, that's a form of historical trauma that I'm trying to heal from, right? So that becomes a stressor in my life as well. It's the same thing for other people. I mean, I don't do this on a regular basis, but I can only imagine that if I took the time to think about what someone's white grandchild thinks of them because they saw them in a history book throwing something at an attempt to desegregate a space or for young girls to go to school. I mean, thinking about that that's part of their history, that they have to, unlearn that and heal from that historical trauma. It's the same. My investment, though, in healing is in communities of color. Mm-hmm. So I would first, encourage people to find some type of healing practice or ritual that supports them when they're experiencing stressors or triggers or where they just need to feel grounded. So that would be the first thing. I think that there would need to be conversations with communities of color around power and justice that remove the ideology of white supremacy, which is a very advanced thing to say. But we have many differences and many different ways that we resist one another when we remove whiteness from a space. So, there's tension in many different communities of color with one another. I mean, Latinos would be one example. I identify as a Black Latina or Latinegra, and that to me is a really important identity. There are Puerto Ricans who do not like Blackness for a variety of different reasons. So that is another, that's one example of how there's in-group stuff that just needs to be sifted through and figured out. I'm sure there's Native communities that really need to discuss what it means to heal with other people of color who are now settlers in your homeland. What do we do about that? So what is we as people of color? What conversations do we need to have? I think then the education system really needs, I think all systems in general need to be revisioned and recreated and rebuilt. But education, since that's my field, I think really needs to be the foundation of whatever the change is. And it can be something as simple as an investment in curiosity or, centering inquiry or whatever it might look like. But I think the idea of needing to receive skills and knowledge and being supported in that journey really needs to be an important part of the framework to have a more just society that's part of my utopia. Then I have a ton of other things around like misogyny and, economic justice and borders. I think borders are kind of not really useful. Things like that come from, again, my own immigrant experience through my parents and being a first-generation U.S. citizen. So that is another part of my framework, too. This is something I could talk about for, weeks. I'm just going to keep it there for this main one.
Well, it's a good snapshot of, of how multifaceted and multi-layered the conversation is, because it's not just about one thing. It's all these different layers. It's economic justice. It's sexual justice. It's misogyny. It's all international things, which in my opinion, the issue about borders is all about protecting economics, essentially, right? So yeah, it's multifaceted, and there isn't going to be one solution to cover all of those aspects of the conversation, and yeah, to find it's not going to be one solution for one thing. So, but I agree with you in that I really truly believe that education is medicine. It heals the mind, right? Ignorance is the cause of all suffering. Period.
Right.
Whether it's like mundane ignorance or universal ignorance, that's the cause of all suffering. So when we bring information, we bring education, we bring a variety of perspectives to the table to find common ground and common solution and where we actually meet. And that's one of the things that I've discovered as I've been processing my own, racial wounding and the damage that it's done and healing from that and reclaiming my power. The thing that I have observed is that on the level of love and pain, I think that those are the two things, the two things that unite us as a species are that we all suffer. We all feel pain, and we actually all feel pain from the same things: injustice, hatred, bigotry. Regardless of who's experiencing it, we all experience pain about the same thing, and we all are united with love. We all have a desire to love and to be loved. So those are two universal keys, I think, that can potentially help us find a solution to all this multitude of nastiness out there.
Yes, for sure. Yes.
Yes, wonderful. So getting close to the end of our conversation, I do want to say that I was so nervous to speak with you today because I had so much respect for you and the work that you did. So it's like totally tripping over my tongue to begin with. And it's such an honor to speak with you because I just have so much admiration for you and the work that you do and your voice and how you stand loud and proud and kind of shine the light and have shown the light for the rest of us. So just much honoring to you.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. So in regards to the Women of Color Sexual Health Network, because some of the feedback that I have gotten from doing these shows recently has been from other women and men of color that are like, oh my God, thank you for speaking out about this. And how can we be connected? How can we be part of this movement? So can you share about who is included in the Women of Color Sexual Health Network and where you're going with this? What are some events? How are you evolving?
Yes, for sure. Thanks for asking that question. So the Women of Color Sexual Health Network, we have a membership directory, so people are encouraged to contact us either through the website. There's a form, that's wocshin.org, or you can send us an email, women of color, or wocshin, WOCSHN, @gmail.com, or info@wocshin.org. And we'll give people instructions to identify as women, specifically women of color. So we do not police people's genitals, nor do we police people's hormones or their racial identity. So if people identify as people of color, regardless of their skin tone or their phenotype, we trust them to identify themselves and we, support them in incorporating themselves into the organization. So we have a closed group right now, which is on Facebook, where we share a lot of the opportunities that we are provided either via email or other friends tagging us or sending them to us, and have other specific conversations that are unique to us in that space. And then we have another space, which is our open page. We have our website, and we have an open page on Facebook, which we update a little bit more than our blogs on our website. And that's a place where people who stand in solidarity with us, people who identify themselves as allies, can come and post things that they think would be of interest or to us, that they think that we should know about or have an opportunity for. Sorry, I live in New York City and there's an ambulance outside. So we're just going to let that pass. I mean, it's New York City living, right? So we definitely have a space for allies as well, because we can't do this work alone. And we do depend on men in our communities as well as our allies to really help us do this work. And we have some amazing allies that have worked with us, and it's through them that we've been being able to actually host a website. We don't have money. We don't yet pay or request people to pay a membership due. And if we did, it would definitely be completely affordable and under $50 a year. So that, we're thinking of a vision where everybody can still be included regardless of their income. But, it's baby steps even for today. So, so those are the ways that people can stay connected. We're on Facebook, we're on Twitter and Tumblr. You can find us on all the social media outlets. And where we're going to be next, so several of our members have their own individual pages. So similar to how you have your own setup and your podcast and your practice, many other members do the same. So it's really important to check out the member directory and find someone that's in your area who might be doing really great things. We try to post those on Facebook, but everybody has, their own hustle that they're promoting. So definitely, stay informed with individuals that you're interested in being connected with. And we're also going to be doing a keynote for the National Sex Ed Conference, which is in December at Rutgers in New Brunswick. It's not at Rutgers. It's in New Brunswick, where Rutgers is, New Jersey. And that's probably the largest sexuality education conference. So we're doing an opening keynote. One of our founding members, Trina Scott, and our executive committee members, Cindy Lee Alves, and one of our allies, Marlene Prey, will be taking the racial justice statement that was created last year at the conference to the next level. And so that'll be a really great and engaging keynote in December on the 9th. And then I have a couple of workshops, as well as Marietta, our other co-founder, and many of us are presenting at that conference as well. So that's probably the next big thing that we're doing as a collective that I can think of off the top of my head. Several of us are also attending ASEC next year, which will be in Puerto Rico. So there'll be several of us attending and doing workshops and pre-conferences as well.
Wow, that is really impressive, and congratulations for being opening keynote at this huge conference. I started my wee little life in New Brunswick at Rutgers. That's where I went to preschool.
Oh, awesome.
Rutgers.
Full circle.
Full circle. I wish I could be there in December. It's wonderful. It's wonderful. So, wrapping up, if you were to give a blossoming sex educator, a woman of color who was aspiring to be a sex educator, what advice would you give her about navigating this field, specifically as a woman of color?
I would first tell her, join the Women of Color Sexual Health Network, and then pose that question to the larger group, because all of us are going to have different points of advice to share. So I did a very traditional route of going through college. So I completed a bachelor's, a master's, and did some PhD work, and then got training. So I've done a very traditional Western way of getting into the field. Other people have come to the field in a variety of ways. Some people never graduated high school, and they're some of the most well-known sex educators in the U.S., even the world. So there's a variety of different ways to come into the field. If people are on the fence about going to school, I would tell them to stay on the fence until they do a little bit more research and think about it. You can always apply and postpone your admission. I mean, there's a variety of different things to do. And I would also suggest to find a mentor. Find someone who you really appreciate, whose voice you really care for, and who you think you can learn something from, and contact them. A lot of us are really accessible, and not many of us, none of us actually in Washington even have like an agent. We really, manage the emails on our own. We manage, the Facebook pages like we're actual people. We don't have like staff to do that for us. So if you need to reach out, definitely reach out. We're totally accessible, and we're willing to support people in getting into this field. So I think mentorship, research are two really important components, and knowing that there's not just one way to get into the field.
Thank you for that. That's really good. And if someone wanted to go the academic route, what are some suggestions? Because I've actually had some people contact me from different areas that they honestly, the colleges in their area do not offer any human sexuality courses like whatsoever. So it's like a dry desert. So what are some resources for people that are maybe in like, the far reaches of, I'm not going to say a state because I don't want to offend anybody, but some place where they don't have any human sexuality courses? What are some places that they could go to receive a really great, full-rounded, all-encompassing education in the field of sexuality?
Right. Well, I would say definitely use your library card. Like it's just it will take you places. So I think with the age of the internet, I know that if I had to do this over again, I probably wouldn't have gone to all the schools that I went to. I definitely feel smarter for going to college. I don't know if it was anything beyond that necessarily, but I feel like I could have also gotten that knowledge in a different way. So I would say it's easy to do, or if you have access to the internet, access to the computer, do a search for human sexuality syllabi or syllabus and see what comes up. And you can download that, you can find those readings online, you can request those books from your library, and you can take an independent study course with yourself. That is one of the things that I would suggest first, is to try it on your own, see what happens. If you enjoy that, great. If you don't, there's plenty of webinars that people provide all over the world. So there's some really great organizations that specialize in providing webinars for people, either specifically seeking a particular focus in the field of sexuality, like therapy, or who want to be clinicians, or even just like a refresher around STIs. So that's the first thing that I would suggest as well, to use your library card. And then also, check out the most recent and updated edition of a human sexuality textbook that's available in your library, because that will have the most up-to-date and current examples, most likely. A lot of that stuff doesn't change. So if you need a refresher around anatomy and physiology, the way that we talk about the brain and reproductive health and body parts hasn't really shifted that much. So you're going to be a good refresher if that's what you need, or a good opportunity to train yourself and learn something. I then would volunteer. So if you're interested in reproductive health, look into like a local Planned Parenthood or family planning center. Consider volunteering at an organization that you respect and that you think does something in the field that you want to be connected in, or even volunteer to do like the social media account for, a nonprofit organization that does sex ed for young people and that needs that type of promotion. And those are the ways you can get other forms of training and be around those sexuality and reproductive justice conversations. So there's definitely a way to do the academic part on a budget, but then there's actual schools that have actual programs that focus on sexuality. So I think the one on the East Coast that's the most well-known is Widener. That's in a city, it's a little bit south of Philadelphia. And they have a human sexuality master's and PhD program for people who are interested in education, research, or being clinicians. You then have a variety of other schools that have other forms of human sexuality focused work. So Morehouse has something like that as well in Atlanta. They used to have a whole kind of, consortium would be a good word, but the program wasn't funded in full, so they just have a couple of classes available. And then there's schools that have like public health programs that have maternal or child health classes, and those are usually a little bit more advanced in the human sexuality focus than traditional like biology courses. So you might have to get a little creative. If you're already in college, look at classes outside of your department and outside of your field. So, if you're in public health, look at, humanities, look at a literature course. There might be a class about sexuality and literature in the Spanish and Portuguese department that's taught in English. Take that class, and you'll get a different perspective as well, because artists really change the way that we talk about our lives and our bodies, and they're very influential as well. So, challenge yourself to get outside of the sciences if that's where you are. Think about theory, but also think about practice as well. This would be some of my advice for academics.
Yeah, thank you for that. And speaking of biology, over the summer I was in a domestic violence and sexual assault training course, and there were mostly college students there, and some biology and medical students, and I had to draw them a picture of what the female clitoris looked like internally, because they were graduating and they had no idea that the internal 90% of the clitoris is inside the body. No idea. So there's a lot missing. And I'm wondering about the human sexuality text. Does that include that information? Has it been updated to include the internal clitoris and all the female erectile tissue?
Some textbooks have, but a majority of them have not. So when I taught my human sexuality class, it was a very introductory level, even though it was a 400 level course. And it did not have that conversation of the internal clitoris. It did have more conversations about how important the clitoris is to sexual pleasure in a way that wasn't misogynistic. So that, I think, is an advancement. But I then had to provide additional resources and reading. So I think the key thing also for your listeners is to take the language that you use, that your guests use, and use those in a search,
yes,
in an internet search. So you can find exactly what you mean when you say internal clitoris, because you might get 10 more emails about, do that drawing.
Right on. Okay, well, thank you so much, Bianca. It's been an absolute pleasure to connect with you and have you on air and discuss all these wonderful, juicy topics. Can you share again how people can get in contact with you, if you want them to?
Yes, of course. Please get in contact with me. So my website is biancaloriano.com. You can also find us at the Women of Color Sexual Health Network, which is WOSCHN.org. And I also host the website LatinoSexuality.com. You can find me there. And I'm actually at Latino Sexuality on Twitter. So that's another way you can find me a little more quickly if you need to.
And then quickly before we wrap, we didn't talk at all about your film, Black Pervert. How can we hear more about that?
Yes. So Black Pervert is going to be a feature-length documentary about the experiences of Black people in the kink community, and it's all Black people. So we have representations of Black Latinos as well. And we're still in production, so if people are interested in being interviewed, please contact us. You can contact me at interview@blackpervert.com. You can also see our trailers at blackpervert.com as well.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure to have you. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this wonderful evening. And be sure to join us next Thursday. Gosh, it's the first Thursday of December. We're closing in on the end of the year. I can't remember what the heck we're going to be talking about next week, but I do know we have the lovely Jennifer Elizabeth Masters co-hosting with me, and so it's sure to be juicy and delicious. Have a beautiful week. Have a beautiful weekend, and make sure to stay connected with me at DavyWardTantra.com, Davy Ward Tantra on Facebook, and Davy Ward Tantra on Twitter. Have a beautiful weekend. Peace out. Okay. Yay. That was wonderful. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for making space and time for me after such a late response.
Yes. It's absolute pleasure to have you. And like I said, it was an honor. I was like, oh my God, I get to talk to Bianca. I'm so nervous. So, the show is going to air, as you know, on Thanksgiving. So I will do the promo for it and share the links. And then the next day, the replay will be available, and I will go ahead and send that to you, and we can post it everywhere.
Okay, awesome. Yay, that sounds great.
Yes.
I'm really excited. Definitely
Yes.
plug it everywhere.
Yay, good.
Yeah. And, I know that Ida mentioned this to you before, but if there's anything that you want to post on the Wakshin blog, just send it to us and we'll post it. So,
Okay, wonderful.
yeah, we're totally down to do that, to help cross-promote, post whatever you want to the open groups as well. So if you want to promote one of your links, definitely post it. You don't have to wait for one of us to do it.
Okay.
So, yeah, you're welcome to do that, too.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I just had an interview recently with a wonderful transgender person, and I would love to post it there because it was such a great interview. So I'll go ahead and do that. I appreciate the invitation.
Sure. Great.
Yeah. Right
So
on.
have
Okay.
a great night. Thank you so much.
Yes, you too. And I look forward to staying in touch.
For sure. Take care.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.